Edward de Bono is genuinely a man who needs a little introduction, one of the world's leading authorities on creative thinking. So without further ado, over to you, Edward.
Most of you will have been persuaded or informed, let's say, that climate change is the biggest problem facing humanity. That's not true. The biggest problem is our poor thinking. Now, there's only one problem bigger than that, which is that we don't realize that our thinking is not as good as we believe it to be. Now, why is that so? There are a number of reasons. The first reason is how the mind actually works. One day a fellow gets up in the morning and he has 11 pieces of clothing to put on. So he sets his computer to work out in how many ways he could get dressed. Computer takes 40 hours non-stop processing. That's not surprising, because 11 pieces of clothing, you actually have 39,916,800 ways of getting dressed. The maths are very simple. It's 11 times 10 times 9 times 8 and so on. If you were to try one way every minute of your waking life, you would need to live to be 76 years old, doing nothing else at all except trying ways of getting dressed. Now, that wouldn't be very convenient. Fortunately for us, the brain doesn't work like that. The brain is designed, indeed the whole purpose of the brain is designed to allow incoming information to organize itself as routine patterns. That is the purpose of the brain. So we set up the pattern, we recognize that this is a getting up pattern, and we just go through it. And that's how we manage to survive in life. That is how language works, because language, we have a word, and a word opens up a pattern. And that is excellent, and so on. I described this all in 1969 in a book called The Mechanism of Mind. The leading physicist in the world, Professor Mario Gell-Mann, who got his Nobel Prize for discovering the quark, read the book, was very enthusiastic. He commissioned a team of top computer programmers to simulate what was said in the book and said, yes, it works exactly as you predict. And he's been a great supporter ever since. So that's the way the brain works, forming patterns, using patterns. Then let's look at another aspect. Imagine a doctor in a clinic, and a patient comes in. The doctor takes the history, examines the patient, does some tests. What is the doctor trying to do? The doctor is trying to identify a standard illness, a standard situation, and once you identify the standard situation, you provide the standard treatment. And I would say 96% of all our thinking is of that sort. Analyze the situation, identify what it is, what it's made up of, and then apply the standard answer. Nothing wrong with that, it's highly effective, but it's not quite enough. Then we come to another reason, which goes back to the history of the human race. Now, when Greek thinking came into Europe at the time of the Renaissance, schools, universities, and thinking were in the hands of the church. The church did not need creative thinking. The church did not need design thinking. The church did not need perceptual thinking. What the church did need was truth, logic, and argument with which to prove heretics wrong. So we developed a very good thinking system for finding the truth. And that has stood us very well indeed in science, technology, and so on. What we have never done culturally, we have never developed thinking for creating value. To be sure, individuals, innovators, inventors, entrepreneurs have done that, but culturally it's not there in education. Thinking for creating value. That's a big difference. In fact, it was even worse with the church, because when the church was arguing, it would start with certain dogmas, certain articles of faith, like God is omnipotent and so on. And if you start with fixed positions, logic is indeed sufficient to reach a conclusion. But in real life, we do not start with fixed positions. In real life, we start with perceptions. And no matter how good your logic is, if your perception is inadequate or faulty, the answer will be rubbish. Indeed, research at Harvard by a friend of mine, David Perkins, shows that 90% of the errors of thinking are not errors of logic at all, they're errors of perception. But this didn't matter for the church because they started with fixed dogma. So we developed thinking based on our patterns, routines, logic, and so on, which is excellent, but not enough. And that's why some time ago, and I mentioned it yesterday, I had to invent a new word. The new word is Abner. Abner means excellent, but not enough. So something may be excellent, but not enough. There may be a chef who cooks the most fantastic omelette. That is excellent. You can't say it's wrong, but it's not enough. So our existing thinking is excellent, but not enough. It's rather like saying a circular saw is excellent for what it's supposed to do, but not very good for cleaning your teeth. In other words, our existing system is very good for looking at what is, but not very good for creating what can be, which is where creativity comes in. So culturally, we've never done anything about that. If you start from fixed positions, fine. So we need to develop, or not develop, add, because our existing thing is excellent, but we need to add the ability to design and to create. Design is very basic. Design means putting together what you have to deliver the values you want. And I believe that at school, every child, every week, should have a design project, whatever it is, and work on it. I used to run, I think I mentioned it yesterday, a design program in an education magazine, and would set a task every week, and the children would make a drawing, using drawings always. Of designs, and one of the exercises was the dog exercising machine, and most of the youngsters would have a treadmill and the dog running on the treadmill and a bone hanging at the end to motivate the dog. But one child, age 4, had a different idea. His dog was towing by means of a string harness, a little trolley, and on the trolley was a car battery from which emerged an electrified prong. And he said, if the dog stops, the trolley will run into him and make him go again. Everyone else was trying to make the dog exercise. This kid said, no, let's prevent him stopping. And design, a very key part of thinking, very neglected. So we have excellent thinking, but not for design, not for creativity. There's no magic about creativity. The brain for creative thinking. The brain forms patterns. Now, all patterns are asymmetric. What does that mean? It means you go from A to B, but you can also go from C to A, but not from A to C. That's asymmetry of patterns. All patterning systems are asymmetric. Now, that gives rise to humor, which is by far the most significant behavior of the human mind. Reason is not particularly significant. Any sorting system run backwards is a reasoning system. Humor depends on asymmetric patterns. You go along here, you get taken here, it makes sense. Typical example I use is old man of 90 dies, goes down to hell. He sees a friend of his, also age 90, sitting there with a beautiful young blonde sitting on his knee. So he says to his friend, "Are you sure this is hell? Because you seem to be having rather a good time." The friend looks up, says, "No," he says, "it's hell all right." He said, "I'm the punishment for her." In other words, once you make the jump, totally logical. Another example, typical blonde joke. Blonde finds a soul bottle, takes the top off, out comes a genie dressed as a belly dancer, and says to the blonde, "You have released me after hundreds of years in the bottle. I must grant you one of three wishes. You can be very rich, very wise, or a great belly dancer." Without any hesitation, the blonde says, "I want to be very wise." Next day, she's having lunch with her friends. She says, "You know, today I'm so wise, I realize I made the worst of three possible choices." Now, exactly the same process happens with creativity. Creativity, we're here, we get taken here. Once we're there in hindsight, totally logical and value in hindsight. There's nothing mysterious, nothing magical about it. There are various techniques for doing it. I'll just very, very quickly mention them. One of them is very simple. You're going along, and you put a block on that. We call that challenge. Challenge is never an attack. Challenge says, this is an excellent idea, maybe the best idea, maybe the only idea, but for the moment, I'm going to put a block on it, and as a result, start looking elsewhere. I'll give you an example. In 1970, I was doing work for Shell Oil in London, and I said, when you drill an oil well, you drill an oil well straight down and have done so for 8 years. No problem, very satisfactory, works well. I said, let's challenge that. Instead of drilling the well straight down, why not go down to the oil seam and go horizontally? They said, we can't do that, the drill won't go around the corner. I said, yes, it will. If you use a hydraulic head, you pull it round. Today, almost every oil well is drilled like that because you get between 6 and 3 times as much oil from this oil well as from that oil well. Indeed, Statoil in Norway has one well going 10 kilometers horizontally. But for 80 years, everyone is very happy with that. Because it worked, wasn't a problem, didn't need thinking about. So challenge. Then there's concept extraction, where we're going along, and we go back and we say, what is the concept behind this? Can we find another way out of the concept? Example here, mayor of a small town here in Australia said, we've got a problem with commuters. They drive into the town, leave their cars parked there all day. No one can park in order to shop. Should we put in parking meters? That's expensive to install and maintain. I said, what's the concept? The concept is to allow people to realize that their parking is limited. I said, well, you could do that in a much simpler way. You can park anywhere you like, for as long as you like, provided you leave your headlights full on. Now, you're not going to leave your car there for 1 minute longer than you need to because you run your battery flat. So in certain parts of town, you just have a notice saying only headlight parking here. Then there's provocation. Provocation really upsets philosophers and logicians because provocation allows you to say something which you know is totally wrong. We call it provocation. And then you use what I call movement to move there. Once you're there, it makes sense. I'll give you a very simple example. One time I was talking to the California Ecology Department, about 500 people, and they said we have a problem with rivers flow this way, factory puts out pollution, people downstream suffer. So as a provocation, I said, the factory is downstream of itself. Sounds pretty impossible, how can it be here and here at the same time? From it comes a very simple idea. which is that normally you take in your water and you put out your pollution. We legislate that if you build a factory on the river, your input must always be downstream of your own output. So you're the first to get your pollution. That is now legislation in 13 countries around the world. Very obvious. Take more care in what you put out because you are going to be the first to use it. Then there's another process. This is the last one I'm going to mention. Which is that if instead of starting here, you start somewhere else, you increase the chance of hitting that track and you can use it. You cannot choose that point because it would lie along your normal thinking, so you use chance. And the simplest way is a random word, usually a noun. Again, that upsets logicians who say if it's any word and any subject, how can it possibly work? But in a patenting system, it does work. One time, one of my trainers in South Africa, setting up a workshop one afternoon for a steel company, ISCOR, just using this technique, they generated 21,000 new ideas in one afternoon. All these processes can be learnt, applied, used, quite formally, quite deliberately. There's no magic, there's no mysteriousness about them. So we can develop additional habits of thinking, not instead of what we do, but in addition to what we do, to generate ideas. One final point. Again, for 2,400 years, we've used argument. A argues with B. Parallel thinking means A and B are looking in the same direction at the same time, but the directions change. And for that, we have the 6 different hats and so on, which is now very, very widely used. Last year, I was told by a Nobel Prize economist, he said, last week I was in Washington, the top economics meeting, they were using our 6 hats. Now, one final point I want to make, and then I'll stop. Many years ago, at the United Nations, I tried to set up a group to provide some additional ideas. And I had various meetings. Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General, was at some of the meetings. Proved absolutely impossible. They said, we are not here to think, we're here to represent our countries, not to think. So that's not going to happen. So somewhere in the world there needs to be a source for new thinking, new ideas. So my project is to set up a palace of thinking, could be here in Australia, which would have 2 functions. One is to provide a platform to collect ideas from anywhere and promote the better ones. And secondly, to set up specific creative meetings to look at world issues, world problems. In other words, our existing thinking is good for recognizing past and standard situation, not good for designing new possibilities. So that's why I say that our thinking, the limits of our thinking are the biggest problem facing the world. And if we improve that, we might improve our way of dealing with climate change. Thank you.